I'm thrilled to be here. I have been working in farmers markets for well over 10 years, 12 years now, and I'm always excited to be able to come to a conference where there's just this beginning energy around networking and sharing information. I've been to a number of state conferences, and your numbers are incredible just in your first conference, and the amount of markets that you're running in Illinois is very impressive. And we are always watching around the country, every state, every farmers market network, just as you do. We're always looking for good ideas from others. So I hope that you realize that. That's one of the reasons we come to steal ideas. So, tricky system. All right. So, I titled this Market Says Fulcrums of Food Systems as we were talking about what I would talk about today. You know, I know that there's going to be a lot of people that in the next 2 days that have great knowledge about their areas of expertise around farmers markets and food stamps, and agriculture and space. And so I'm going to let them be the experts, and I'm going to just give you the big idea, the ideas that I think help me think about what farmers markets really accomplish, and that maybe is really what I'm supposed to do, is give you the big idea that you can then take and use the next couple of days to try to unpack. So I used the word fulcrums, you can see it, and I thought about this a couple of days ago, is that the right word I wanted to use? So I looked at the definition, you know, after having used it a dozen times. And thought, yeah, that is. So I looked up the definition, and I love the definition actually. Fulcrum is the support about which a lever pivots. And I thought about, yeah, that's what I mean, because I think of the lever as the active community that surrounds the market community. And the fact that that market community can pivot in any direction when there's a successful farmers market is exactly how I see farmers markets. So Pat talked a little bit about my history. So I have been working in markets for a long time, but I come out of the 1980s and 90s working in the Midwest on social change issues, environmental consumer issues in states like Ohio and Indiana, and actually across the South. And when I worked on all those issues back in the 80s and 90s, whether right to know, utility reform, you know, we'd win some or we'd lose some, right? We'd do well, we'd do good work, and then we would find that the movement maybe kind of lost track, or we got a little co-opted. And it was interesting, when I found the farmers market community, I realized that what we had here was the opportunity to really be the thing that could create a movement across issues. It wouldn't just be around one idea. And when I went and found the New Orleans farm, when I moved back to New Orleans in 99, 2000, and found the markets there, the founder, Richard McCarthy, said to me as I met him, I see this as the way that many communities can come together and work on social change. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. That's exactly how I feel about it. And so we joined together, he and I, for over 10 years, working on many different projects in our region and across the country on farmers markets, because we believe that markets really do sit in the middle of this system. That in order, when you go around the country to look at where community food systems are thriving, there should be some sort of democratic space for everybody to come together and figure out their own place in it. And that, to me, that's what the farmers market is. Never get this right. Next. All right, so I'm sure some of you have seen this definition of community food system. Some of you may have worked on it. I think it's very important to remember what we're talking about, that this is a whole system. We're not talking about just a piece of a system. We're talking about being fulcrums of these systems. We're talking about a complete system. So, of course, in the farmers market part of it, we're really in the distribution piece, but we have to think about the other pieces of it, production, processing, and consumption. And I think as farmers markets, we tend to be thinking, okay, let's make sure the sales are there, let's make sure the people are in market. But really our job is to remember that we have to help all pieces of that part of the food system. And then if you go to the bottom, here we talk about it's hard to see from here, Farmers Market Coalition's definition, what they call the triple bottom line, right? They could have just said, look, farmers markets are for everyone. I mean, many of us do. But they decided to actually say, they're for farmers, they're for shoppers, and they're for the larger community. They wanted to really make sure that we weren't just going to forget about the farmer as being part of this partnership. We didn't want to just think about those who were buying things in the marketplace as who we serve. We serve everybody because the market can really impact the larger community. So that was, I think that we called this the triple bottom line, which has, had its, foes and friends, that language. But the idea is that we're talking about that farmers markets serve a much larger group of people than those that are actually in the marketplace at any one time. Those people who live near a market, who are impacted by the actual visual place of the marketplace. Those community organizers working in farm to school or community gardens, those people as well benefit and are part of the farmers market. And then we talked about, in the introduction, it talked about what I was going to talk about as indicators. And of course, you're going to hear a lot more of that excellent language from people like Ken. That what we've learned also is that in order to really say that we do all these things and that we serve these communities, we're going to have to start measuring that. We're going to have to show you how we do that. And so in the farmers market community, there's this growing language around the economic, social, intellectual, and natural capital that we add in the community. And those are some pretty big words to use for this thing that's 4 hours in the morning on Saturday. But we feel there are a lot of ways for us to measure the success of this. And why we should measure the success of it is exactly why you're all here today, right? You're here to share and you're here to build something that's larger than your little market so that you can change policy, you can bring more people to the table, and that's why we have to measure it. So economic, social, intellectual, and natural are where we're starting, but we're not going to stay there, I can guarantee. So this is where, when we think about where we're going, I think it's important to remember where we began. So where we began, over the years I've spent a lot of time asking farmers and market organizers and advocates to talk about the early days of markets, which of course some love to do. And really what I've come to in a very abbreviated way is to explain this to myself and other people that are talking about markets in this way. So if you look back in the 1970s, of course, the first advocates for farmers markets were the actual farmers themselves, the back-to-land farmers who saw their opportunity to go back and reclaim their communities, and were selling to co-ops and other places, and then decided really they needed farmers markets. So places like Athens, Ohio, and Carrboro, North Carolina, and many markets like that have existed for well over 30 years. You go back and you see who actually founded those markets were the farmers themselves. Many of those markets are still run entirely by the farmers. Interestingly, many of those farmers continue to be vendors at those markets or be leaders in their community. So they really saw themselves as establishing something. And then, of course, in some cities, they were establishing right on the shreds of the old system. So like in my city of New Orleans, we had 32 public markets up until the middle of the early 20th century, one of the largest public market systems. Well, of course, by 1970, it was completely gone. And so farmers came in to build a system that would exist, but maybe exist in a slightly different fashion. So the first thing they do when they open these farmers markets is to put criteria in. The first criteria is you grow it to sell it. The people that are behind the tables are the people who grew the food. That's always a pretty radical idea if you think about it. It's a pretty radical idea to say that and to do it and to be there Saturday morning after Saturday morning and to be able to convince people that this is important, that they actually meet the people who grow the food. That had not been so important in the years right before that. So it's a radical idea, and that criteria, grower only, is the first main criteria of our 21st century farmers market movement. And then the second is, in the early 80s, late 80s, early 90s, we started to see neighborhood organizers use the market as a way to reclaim town squares, to think about social space, to think about education. This picture actually is of the founder of the New Orleans market, Richard McCarthy, and a woman from a market across the lake, Jan from Covington. And these two started their markets about the same time. This is a picture. I brought Richard to her market last year, and they hadn't seen each other since the 90s, since they started the markets, and they were having this conversation. I thought, wasn't that interesting? There's these two coming back together sharing ideas. So those neighborhood organizers looked at the farmers market that were existing, the small group of markets that farmers had begun, and they said, this is a good idea. They adopted that grower-only criteria, they respected it, and they added on top of that the idea of using the market as a town square for civic engagement, for education. And those markets are in places like New Orleans or Seattle or the DuPont Circle market, of course, very famous set of markets. All of those organizers, and there's a lot of them, continue to exist. And interestingly, that level, that group of markets tends to be a lot of the network leaders. They look at the movement as a whole as well. So it's actually interesting to see how each of these groups of markets end up existing today. And of course, Richard just became the executive director of Slow Food USA. So we actually just lost him in New Orleans after 18 years of running the markets there. So we're excited for him, but it shows the evolution. The other group that comes about that same time are the folks that are doing Main Street organizing. So this is interesting. A lot of rural communities, of course, use the Main Street program to help rebuild their downtowns. And a lot of those Main Street programs look to farmers markets as a way to do that. And so you start to see little towns opening farmers markets that are using to really incubate and anchor their small downtowns. I think of towns in the South like Natchitoches, Louisiana, Ocean Springs, Mississippi. There are literally so many of them. But a lot of these are smaller towns running markets. And those organizers see themselves as really incubating new businesses, as adding new businesses. We start to see the climb of value-added product in market, of people actually increasing, they're changing the rules to allow value-added. A lot of markets hadn't allowed it before that. And then, of course, in the mid-2000s, we invite the public health community, and we've invited them before, but they didn't think it was really that important. But I remember going to public health in Louisiana, and we're trying to work with them in early 1999, 2000, 2001, and they're like, I'm not so sure this is for us. But by 2004, 2005, we are certainly in a place where I think we have enough impact, we have enough markets, we have the right focus that public health says, you know what, we're going to think about this. And we start seeing markets opening from public health point of view. And of course, things like Camden, New Jersey is a good example of one. It's really about behavior change and food access, and a lot of food security markets are opening. And there, of course, is around food access. So each of those groups of people bring to the table another set of criteria that we add on to the farmers market to be who we are today, to say, look, this is these groups bring together who we are. So the first set of indicators we talked about is economic. You're going to hear a lot more of that from people like Ken. There's an enormous amount of research in your region around economic, and more coming all the time. But what I want to say about economic information is, a lot of markets fear this. They fear gathering data on their farmers. Well, farmers don't like to be asked what they're making. I don't blame you. I live in the South, and you don't necessarily walk up to a farmer and say, what'd you make today? I don't like that. Who are you? How much you make today? A lot of that going on. And so, we realize this, but yet we have to gather. We've got to find ways to gather data. It may be that we have to be a little more inventive about it. Maybe we don't just walk up to the farmer and ask them how much money they made. Maybe we find other ways. The picture you're seeing is actually of the tool that we created in New Orleans that we call SEED, which stands for the Sticky Economic Evaluation Device. We did have the acronym before we had the name. And in our web guides, like, here's what we'll call it. Okay, that's fine. But the idea was that local money was sticky, staying in the economy longer. And our whole premise around economic issues in the market comes really from Jane Jacobs' interesting, I guess it's a metaphor, around the rainforest economy, how money stays and nurtures, plants stay together. And we think that rainforest economy is a great visual for local food systems. And that's what we have to find ways to measure. We've got to find ways to think about what are the little transactions that are happening because of your farmer's market that you can capture and then illuminate to other stakeholders in your region.